So if you want to paint a hyper-realistic, brilliant blue sky, the very first color you should put on your pristine white canvas is actually a bright, fiery orange.
I mean, I know it sounds completely backward, right?
Yeah, it sounds like absolute self-sabotage to me.
But doing the exact opposite of what your brain tells you to do is, well, it's essentially the secret to museum quality art.
And dismantling that trap is exactly our mission today. Welcome to the Duck Dive. We are uncovering the hidden architecture of a painting today.
Yeah, that secret underlying foundation that separates a flat amateur canvas from a masterpiece that practically pulls you across a gallery floor.
Exactly. And our insights today, they come directly from the artists at Grupo RAIIM. They're going to walk us through the science, the optical physics, and really the sheer discipline required to manipulate how the human eye perceives color and depth.
Because it completely defies our everyday logic.
Yeah.
Like imagine you're staring at a blank canvas and you want to paint a white horse in a field. Your immediate instinct is probably to reach for a giant tube of pure titanium white paint and just start brushing it onto the canvas.
I mean, yeah, it seems like common sense. You see white, you use white. You see a blue sky, you grab the brightest ultramarine blue.
Exactly. But in the realm of professional painting, that direct, literal approach is a massive trap.
So to understand why that direct approach fails, why painting a white horse with white paint right out of the gate actually flattens the image, we kind of have to hit rewind, don't we?
We do. We need to go to the exact moment before you even attempt to render a subject.
Yeah.
We have to look at the tonal value of the canvas itself.
The actual starting ground.
Right. Rodolfo Im breaks down this concept by asking us to look at the canvas as like a physical landscape of light and dark.
Because an off-the-shelf canvas is usually stark, blindingly white.
Yeah, and that stark white, or on the flip side, a pitch black canvas, creates a massive structural hindrance. I mean, think about it geographically. If your base layer is pure black, you are starting your painting at the absolute bottom of a visual valley. The only possible direction you can move your values is lighter.
Right, because you have zero room to push your shadows any deeper into darkness. You're already at maximum black.
Exactly. You've hit the floor before you even pick up a brush. And if you start on that factory white canvas, well, you have the exact opposite problem.
You are stranded at the absolute peak of the mountain.
You've totally eliminated your headroom. If your background is already as bright as it can possibly be, you can only build your painting by making things darker.
Which means you lose the ability to add those really luminous popping highlights later on.
Precisely. And this is why the professional method always begins by sort of destroying the blank canvas with an intermediate midtone.
You establish a ground that is somewhere in the middle.
Yeah, usually a slightly warm mid-value wash.
You know, it's like a sound engineer setting up an equalizer for a new track. Like if you start mixing a song with the bass and the treble already maxed out to 10.
You have literally nowhere to go.
Exactly. You can't bring out the nuance of a specific vocal line or, say, a quiet acoustic guitar because the entire track is already screaming at maximum volume.
That is a perfect analogy.
You have to start in the middle to give the dynamics room to breathe so the quiet moments can actually be quiet and the loud moments have real impact.
And that need for dynamic range is exactly why the midtone is so crucial. When you establish that intermediate value, you grant yourself the mechanical power to build volume in both directions simultaneously.
I see.
So as the painting develops, you can push the shadows down into this really rich darkness and pull the highlights up into the light.
But beyond just managing your light and dark values, that base layer serves another critical function too, right? Dimensional unity.
Yes, absolutely. A homogeneous base color acts as an underlying glue.
Meaning it ties all the physical elements of the painting together.
Exactly. Imagine you're painting a really complex landscape. You have a sky, distant mountains, a grassy horizon, maybe a large oak tree in the foreground.
A lot of different pieces.
Right. And if you paint all those separate elements directly onto a pure white canvas, they're going to look entirely disconnected.
Because they won't share any visual DNA.
Yeah, it will look as if they were cut out of different magazines and just pasted next to each other.
Because there's nothing actually integrating them beneath the surface.
Exactly. But when you lay down a unified midtone first, tiny, almost microscopic fragments of that base color will inevitably peek through the subsequent layers of paint.
Oh, wow.
And even when it doesn't peek through directly, it influences the opacity and temperature of the layers above it. It ensures that everything in that painted world belongs to the exact same atmosphere.
So we've solved the problem of the tone. We need that middle ground to give us range and unity. But That brings up a massive technical question for me.
It's that.
How do we choose the actual hue? Like, if my goal is pure, breathtaking realism, let's go back to that sweeping blue sky from the beginning. What color is my foundation?
Well, this is where Laura Palacios provides some really brilliant counterintuitive direction. If your goal is to paint a cool toned scene, like that blue sky or a deeply shadowed cool green forest, you must lay down a warm complementary base.
So for a blue sky, you are going to mix yellow and red to create an orange foundation.
Yes. You might mute that orange slightly with some cream or a raw umber so it isn't completely neon. But the fundamental chemistry of your canvas is going to be warm orange.
Wait. If you lay down a warm orange base and then brush cool blue right over it, wouldn't the physical mixing of those pigments just turn everything into a muddy, unappealing gray sludge? I mean, you're combining opposites.
But that's where the technique of layering comes in. You aren't physically mixing wet paints into mud on the palette.
Oh, I see.
You are utilizing optical mixing right on the canvas. You lay down the warm orange base and you let it set, completely dry.
Okay.
Then you apply the blue over it using techniques like scumbling, which is basically dragging a thin, broken layer of opaque paint or glazing, where you use a semi-transparent medium.
So the layers stay distinct.
Exactly. And the light from the room actually penetrates that top layer of blue, hits the orange underneath, and bounces back to your eye.
So the colors are mixing in my retina, not actually on the canvas.
Precisely.
But why go through that elaborate process? Like, why not just use the perfect blue straight from the tube?
Because that perfect tube blue is synthetic. I mean, it was milled in a factory. If you apply it purely, it has this rigid, almost plastic quality that immediately registers to the human brain as artificial.
Because nature doesn't look like a plastic toy.
Right. Nature is incredibly complex. A real sky isn't just blue, you know. It has warmth from the sun bouncing through the atmosphere, moisture, dust particles. Nature is a constant vibrating blend of visual contradictions.
You know, it's like a chef adding a pinch of coarse sea salt to a rich, dark chocolate caramel.
Oh, I like that.
Yeah, you introduce the exact opposite flavor, and rather than ruining the dessert, that tiny hit of salt actually neutralizes the overwhelming bitterness and tricks the palate into experiencing the sweetness with so much more depth.
That optical trick is the absolute core of complementary warfare.
Complementary warfare. I love that term.
When you superimpose cool blues or greens over a warm orange base, the complementary wavelengths subtly fight each other. And in doing so, they neutralize that shrill plastic perfection of the tube paint.
So the warm base dulls the artificial quality of the cool top layer just enough to mimic the complexity of the natural world.
Exactly. It makes it breathe.
You're essentially engineering a deliberate flaw to make the illusion perfect.
That is beautifully put. And Laura Palacios highlights this perfectly when discussing atmospheric perspective, like painting a distant green horizon.
Okay.
If you want that distant grassy field to look real, and critically, if you want it to look like it is miles away, you cannot paint it with pure, highly saturated green.
Right.
You have to desaturate it.
And assuming you don't just dump black into it to darken it, how are you pulling the saturation out while keeping it looking like grass?
Well, you rely on the physics of the color wheel. You desaturate that green by introducing its complement.
Bringing in the opposite.
Yes. You can mix in a raw umber, which naturally contains the opposing warm tones. Or, for a more precise neutralization, you add just a tiny touch of magenta.
Because magenta brings the red wavelength. And since green is already handling the yellow and blue, adding red completes the primary triad, essentially canceling out the vibrance.
You're neutralizing the frequency. That tiny touch of magenta pulls the green back into reality.
It grounds it.
Yeah, it lowers its intensity, which perfectly mimics how the Earth's atmosphere scatters light over long distances, making the field seamlessly recede into the background.
Okay, so we've established how complementary colors neutralize each other to create stunning realism. But color is incredibly versatile, and realism isn't always the goal, right?
Absolutely not.
What if I want a painting that vibrates with intense, almost supernatural energy? If I'm painting a highly abstract, fiery sunset, do I still use that complementary orange under blue warfare?
You completely abandon it. Yeah. If your goal is maximum vibrancy, Grupo RAIIM explains that you have to switch to analogous colors for your base.
Analogous.
Right. You don't want the layers to fight and neutralize. You want them to align.
Analogous meaning adjacent on the color wheel. The neighbors.
The brothers and cousins of your target color.
Yeah.
If you are building a brilliant, glowing red painting, You do not start with a green or blue base.
Because that would kill the glow.
Exactly. You start with a lighter, highly reflective yellow base. You let that dry. Then you apply a layer of orange, let that dry. And only then do you apply your powerful, semi-transparent reds.
So if complementary colors are like putting on noise-canceling headphones to mute the artificial tones, analogous colors are like assembling a massive choir, where the yellow, the orange, and the red are all singing the exact same chord to make a single note absolutely boom across the room.
The wavelengths amplify rather than cancel out. Because they share underlying color relationships, as the light travels through those transparent layers of red and orange, it hits that luminous yellow base and reflects back with an incredible compounded glow.
Oh, wow.
It creates a super vibrant, almost stained glass effect that is physically impossible to achieve by just slapping thick red paint onto a white canvas.
But doesn't that cause, like, visual fatigue? If you build a painting entirely out of yellow, orange, and red layers perfectly amplifying each other, a purely fiery painting sounds like staring into an actual furnace.
It absolutely can, which brings up a critical part of the process. Your retina has cone cells that process color. And if they're constantly bombarded by high-frequency warm wavelengths, they actually become exhausted.
Oh, physiological fatigue.
Yeah, the vibrant color will start to look flat and muddy to your brain simply because your eyes are literally tired.
So how do you fix that?
Well, Rodolfo Im shares a specific technique to manage this heat. An artist might build that wonderfully warm base using Naples yellow and a rich red oxide.
Okay, very warm.
But to keep the canvas from overpowering the viewer, they will purposefully introduce a cool anchor, specifically Payne's gray.
Payne's gray, that's a very dark, cool, almost bluish gray pigment, right?
Exactly. By placing that cool, dense Payne's gray against the fiery warmth of the Naples, yellow and red oxide, they create necessary contrast.
It gives the eye a break.
Yes, counteracts the heat and gives the viewer's eye a physical place to rest and reset. Nature constantly negotiates between warm sunlight and cool shadows. You have to balance the equation so the vibrancy actually maintains its impact.
So we've solved how to make the base colors vibrate, and we know how to manage the visual heat. But color temperature is really only half the battle.
Right.
If we apply all of this back to our white horse from the very beginning, how do we handle the physical brightness? We know starting on white is a trap, and we know grabbing a tube of pure titanium white on stroke 1 is an error. So how do we actually build this subject without flattening the image?
Well, it requires an immense amount of psychological restraint from the artist.
Restraint.
Yeah, you have to build the entire anatomical form of that horse using desaturated nuanced tones first.
So no white at all.
Nope. You work with soft creams, raw umbers, subtle bluish grays to map out the musculature, the shadows, the volume. You establish the entire three-dimensional structure using these quiet, kind of muddy colors.
You are meticulously painting a white horse without using any white paint.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You hold it back until the absolute final moments of the painting.
Mm-hmm.
Only when the entire structure is completely modeled out of those desaturated tones do you finally reach for that pure, saturated titanium white.
And then you just cover it.
No, you apply it sparingly. Only to the absolute brightest highlights. The glint of sunlight on the shoulder, the reflection in the eye, the sharp edge of the mane.
So what is the physical mechanism behind that? Like, why does delaying the white until the very end fundamentally change how we perceive the horse?
It really comes down to the physics of saturation and chemical opacity, which Laura Palacios details beautifully. The human eye processes spatial depth based on saturation. Saturated, pure colors naturally advance. They push forward toward the viewer's eye. Desaturated, muted colors naturally recede. They sink back into the distance. And pigments like titanium white are also chemically dense and intensely opaque.
So if I had painted the whole horse pure white right from the start.
You kill the transparency and you completely flatten the depth.
Yeah.
Every inch of that horse would be screaming at the viewer with equal intensity, trying to advance toward the eye at the exact same time.
So nothing stands out because there's no recessive space.
Right. But by actively keeping the base of the horse muted and desaturated, you create a recessive bed.
I see.
When you finally place that one pristine, brilliant stroke of pure white on top of those muted umbers, it physically appears to float off the surface of the canvas. It pops forward with incredible three-dimensional force.
So to make anything look brilliantly bright, it absolutely requires a dark, desaturated foundation beneath it to push off of. I am just marveling at the discipline of the artist here. I mean,
Hmm.
you have this brilliant, shining white horse in your mind. The pure white paint is sitting right there on your palette, calling to you.
It's tempting.
Very, and yet you have to hold back the most satisfying color, the color that literally defines the subject for hours, maybe weeks. You have to trust the optical physics.
You really do.
You have to trust that those muddy creams and bluish grays are doing the heavy lifting, basically building the stage and the shadows so that the star can finally make its entrance.
It is the ultimate exercise in trusting the process.
Mhm.
And honestly, that discipline is precisely what elevates a painting from a flat, literal reproduction of an image into a living, breathing work of art that actually captures light.
It fundamentally changes how you think about what a painting actually is. I mean, we started this deep dive talking about the trap of the blank canvas and the beginner's instinct to just directly copy the colors they think they see on the surface.
Right.
But what Grupo RAIIM has shown us is that a masterpiece isn't a surface at all.
No, it is a meticulously engineered foundation of hidden contradictions. The artist is constantly playing a game of optical chess.
Placing warm colors under cool skies to make the atmosphere vibrate.
Burying dull, muted umbers beneath vibrant greens to simulate atmospheric distance.
Building deep shadows first so the final highlights have something to physically bounce off of.
It really makes you realize that the art we fall in love with is doing so much invisible work right in front of our eyes.
The true magic of a painting always lies in the layers you aren't consciously processing.
Absolutely.
Which brings me to a final thought I want to leave you with today.
Okay.
The next time you find yourself wandering through an art gallery and you stop in front of a painting and you are absolutely mesmerized by a vibrant, glowing focal point, maybe it's a ray of sunlight hitting a dress or the brilliant popping white crest of an ocean wave, I want you to force yourself to look away from it.
It's hard to do.
It is. But tear your eyes away from the brightest, most saturated part of the canvas. Look down into the muted shadows. Look at the desaturated, quiet background in the corners of the frame. And ask yourself, what hidden, contradictory, muddy colors had to be sacrificed in the dark so that this one bright highlight could sing so loudly?
That is the true secret of the hidden architecture.
Thanks for taking this deep dive with us. We'll see you next time.